into the vicious cycle of sex trafficking. I asked when the Liberal government would start fighting this horrific form of modern-day slavery. This is not the first time I've raised this issue of sex trafficking and the lack of action by this government. In fact, exactly 1 year ago, I stood here raising the same issue during an adjournment, and in the past 12 months, this government has done nothing. In fact, since coming to power, the Liberals have allowed the fight against human trafficking to languish. The Liberals allowed the National Action Plan to combat human trafficking to expire. They ended funding for NGOs. They've blocked important tools for police and that were adopted by this House over 4 years ago. And then the Liberals introduced legislation, Bill C-38, to lighten sentences for sex traffickers. A week ago, the Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Public Safety, in his response to my question during question period, claimed the government's Bill C-38 would give police and prosecutors new tools to investigate human trafficking. Now, I would never suggest that the member was misleading the House, but I would rather give the member the benefit of the doubt that he may not have read Bill C-38 in answering the question. Because if he had read it, he would know that Bill C-38 is only one paragraph and does not have any provisions whatsoever that give police or prosecutors new tools to investigate human trafficking. Even the Minister for Justice, when she introduced Bill C-38 last February, wrongly claimed that C-38 had tools for police and prosecutors to combat human trafficking. However, the tools they pretend are in C-38 were in fact unanimously adopted by this House 4 years ago in an NDP private member's bill, C-452, which was supported by a Conservative government and voted on by the current Prime Minister. It was C-452 that created the presumption with respect to the exploitation of one person by another, added the offence of trafficking in persons to the list of offences to which the reverse onus forfeiture of proceeds of crime provisions would apply, corrected a technical discrepancy, and included the provision of human trafficking sentence would be served consecutively. Bill C-452 received royal assent in June 2015. Then the Liberal government came into power and has since blocked Bill C-452 from coming into force. Why? Because the Liberals don't like the idea that sex traffickers might face consecutive sentences. They feel that it's too harsh to expect that a child trafficker should serve a long sentence for exploiting a minor in sex slavery. All Bill C-38 does is prevent sex traffickers from receiving consecutive sentences. That's it. Nothing more. It certainly doesn't help the police. Mr. Speaker, 80% of victims of sex trafficking have never come forward out of fear. All of the human traffickers investigators who have testified on Bill C-452 welcomed the consecutive sentencing and highlighted that it was long sentences give victims the confidence to come forward and testify. They also point out that without consecutive sentencing, a pimp who traffics only one minor will receive the same sentence as a pimp who traffics 5 or 10 minors. Consecutive sentencing allows for punishments that better reflect the gravity of the situation. So, Mr. Speaker, when will this government stop misleading the public about C-38? When will they stop blocking important tools for the police? And when will the Liberals stand up for the victims of sex trafficking instead of blocking tougher sentences for those who enslave them? Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Parliamentary Secretary to the Minister of Justice.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. And, you know, it's regrettable to hear that kind of hyperbole and that kind of rhetoric from my honourable colleague who is, you know, would be more appropriate to hear that from his usual seat in the House. I noticed that he's come on this side of the aisle. And on this side of the aisle, we actually are quite proud of our record when it comes to human trafficking. And I'll get to that in just a moment, Mr. Speaker. But I would point out that maybe it wasn't my honourable colleague, but certainly the last Conservative government cut close to $1 billion from the public safety portfolio, including from the CBSA, from the RCMP, and all of that undermines many of the gross assertions that he just made. But now returning to the question at hand, human trafficking is a heinous crime and a human rights offence. In collaboration with provinces and territories, Indigenous communities, law enforcement and community organizations, as well as international partners, we are using a wide variety of measures to combat human trafficking, to support victims and potential victims, and to ensure that perpetrators are brought to justice. Indeed, the National Action Plan to Combat Human Trafficking was a 4-year initiative that ran until last year. Since then, Public Safety Canada has been leading a formal evaluation of the action plan to help inform how we move forward on this important issue. While that evaluation has been going on, federal departments and agencies have continued to combat human trafficking through a full range of initiatives. We have, for example, and my honourable colleague referred to it, introduced Bill C-38. And contrary to what he said, this House has debated and thoughtfully had a discourse about reversing some of the presumptions or easing some of the presumptions when it comes to the burden of proof so that prosecutors can ensure that offenders who participate in human trafficking are held to account. And unlike the last Conservative government, we believe that we have an appropriate sentencing regime where we place faith in our judiciary. That means not supporting unconstitutional mandatory minimums like the last Conservative government introduced and which have been struck down by the Supreme Court of Canada. That means ensuring that we have an appropriate mandatory minimum sentencing regime, one that is evidence-based. But let me just continue for a moment. In addition to Bill C-38, we've also introduced Bill C-21, which will be an important new tool to help combat cross-border crimes. The RCMP has several initiatives that target human trafficking. Their Human Trafficking National Coordination Centre conducts public awareness campaigns, training, and awareness sessions for law enforcement and stakeholders, as well as national threat assessments on human trafficking. And this past October, the RCMP partnered with police agencies and community organizations across Canada in a coordinated anti-trafficking effort called Operation Spotlight. There was also Project Protect, a joint initiative between the Government of Canada and the private sector. It allows Canadian financial institutions to report transactions that are suspected of money laundering related to trafficking in persons for sexual exploitation. The impact of Project Protect on identifying suspicious transactions linking money laundering to human trafficking has been phenomenal. In 2015, prior to Project Protect, there were 19 such disclosures. In 2016-2017, the government made over $21 million available to provinces, territories, and non-governmental organizations through the Federal Victims Fund. And in Budget 2017, Mr. Speaker, you will recall that the government allocated $100.9 million over 5 years to establish a national strategy on gender-based violence, which obviously overlaps with human trafficking. The point being, Mr. Speaker, that on this side of the House, contrary to where my honourable colleague is currently sitting, we believe in evidence-based policy making. We believe in supporting our law enforcement branches to ensure that women and girls are protected as part of our overall national plan when it comes to human trafficking. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Honourable member for Peace River, Westlock.
Well, Mr. Speaker, if the Liberals were investing in fighting sex trafficking, why did they allow the National Action Plan and its funding to expire a year ago? They had a whole year to get their plan in place, and now we're one of the only countries in the Western world that does not have any strategy to combat human trafficking. In 2011, the Conservatives were the first and only political party in Canadian history to make human trafficking an election promise. 12 months later, in 2012, the Conservatives fulfilled their promise and launched the 4-year action plan to combat human trafficking. This plan included funding for survivors and law enforcement and focused on 4 areas: to protect, to prosecute, prevent, and partnerships. A year later, the Conservative government launched a special RCMP enforcement combat human trafficking team force, and this led initiatives to combat human trafficking at the UN. Mr. Speaker, it's been 2 years since the Liberals were elected and no action to combat human trafficking. Will this government commit to developing a new action plan to combat human trafficking and restore the support for victims of sex trafficking and law enforcement? Will this government work with the opposition to fight modern-day slavery together?
Honourable Parliamentary Secretary.
Mr. Speaker, I want to assure my colleague that we have been evaluating the National Action Plan in order to ensure that we can make Canada's efforts to combat human trafficking stronger and more effective. And as I outlined, that evaluation has been happening simultaneously with a comprehensive suite of measures both within Canada and on an international scale. Canada continues to work with international partners and agencies such as the United Nations Office on Drugs and Crime, the International Office for Migration, and Interpol, among others, to fight against human trafficking trafficking and provide technical assistance and capacity building, enabling the global effort to successfully address trafficking in persons. And we engage regularly with the United States and Mexico through the Trilateral Working Group on Trafficking in Persons. The fight against human trafficking, both at home and internationally, is a moral imperative, and it is of the utmost importance for our government. I would urge my honourable colleague, since he's sitting on this side of this House, to support this side of the House's important work on this important file. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
The motion to adjourn the House is now deemed.